Hello, friends. Welcome to the Sui AMA. Today, we'll be discussing dynamic fields. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Today, I'm here with Ashok and Todd. Would you like to introduce yourselves?
Sure. So hi, I'm Ashok or Ashok. I joined the Move team at Mission Labs just over a month ago. So dynamic fields is very exciting for me. It's kind of the first major feature I've been working with Todd on. Before that, I was at Meta. I was working on programming languages there and supporting the mobile language ecosystem there.
Fantastic. We're happy to have you. Welcome. Todd, would you like to introduce yourself as well?
Sure, yeah. I've been at Miston for 8 months or so. Before that, though, I've been working on Move since about 2018. So a little while here now. But yeah, I've just been working on Move. I was also at Meta beforehand, but on different projects.
Awesome. Well, thank you both for joining us. We're here primarily to talk about dynamic fields. So would either of you like to describe dynamic fields and why we should be interested?
Yeah. So I know a lot of people have been asking kind of what are dynamic fields even? I think internally we've been so heads down on them and comparing them to child objects that we had a bit of tunnel vision there. So what they are a way to add and remove fields on the fly. So unlike the fields that we're used to in structs, where you have to find them ahead of time, publish the package, and then those are the fields you get whenever you create new instances, dynamic fields are way more flexible. So after you've defined that struct, published it, even created that struct before, later you can come around and add fields to it. And those fields can be not only added and removed, but the names can be way more expressive than what we're used to in terms of just being identifiers. They can be arbitrary move values up to some restriction. So if you're familiar with Move, then they have to have copy, drop, and store. But other than that, you can be a lot more adventurous with the field names as well. And so that gives, a whole lot more flexibility for all of our builders, but also for us to build tools like the bag and table APIs, which give you access to collection types, which has been a long requested feature. In terms of how they look when you're in the language, they are not new language syntax. So you interact with them using move functions so that they're a library, but there is kind of new behavior under the hood inside Sui to power them.
Very interesting. Now, you covered a lot there, but Todd, is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, we'll speak a bit more about some of the backstory here and kind of why they're important, and a little bit more about, child objects. So child objects were sort of our solution to partitioning data or, breaking up large objects into smaller objects to make it a bit easier to transfer things. You can imagine our example was always, like a marketplace, and a listing would be a child object of the parent marketplace. And that works really well for these sort of narrow applications. But there's sort of two problems here, right? Or kind of two separate. There's one problem with the child objects and then sort of a more general problem. And the problem with child objects was that they were really annoying to use. You kind of had to determine your entire parent history to pass in as arguments to the function. So in Sui Move, you pass in objects or object IDs as arguments. And with the child object rule, you had to pass in not just the child object, but the parent. And so if you had a chain of child objects, you'd have to pass in the parent and the grandparent and the great-grandparent, or whatever you want to call it. It was very limiting for trying to build different applications with child objects, because you sort of had to do this computation ahead of time to find out what child object you wanted and then what objects you needed to pass in ahead of time. It just wasn't a good experience. So dynamic fields solves this in that you only have to pass in the parent object. And then dynamically, you can, as Ashok was describing, you can just determine what field you want to access using a move value. There's a sort of like deeper problem here, though, that we didn't really address with child objects, or we weren't able to, and that is just scalable storage or extensible storage. This has been a sort of a problem in Move that we've been thinking about for a very long time. You have a struct, and this is even in core Move, this is our way of accessing storage is, a struct kind of defines a schema for a value in storage. And so what is it like, how do you manage something that you want to be a very large value? Because if you just put a vector in there or some other sort of scalable data type, you have this problem of when you deserialize it or you try to load the value, it's going to explode. You can't just put a million objects in there. Imagine you're doing an airdrop or something and you want to have kind of all of these pre-allocated tokens for people to come in and grab. It's very difficult to set that up if you have to put them all in one object or one vector, because the size of the value would just be too large. So on core Move, there was this push to develop something that they also called tables. But the table API there, right, is only this key value storage. And you have to explicitly kind of have this table. I really like where we've landed with dynamic fields, that any object, or really any UID, that is the identifier for an object, can act as an entry point into storage for you to extend and write values dynamically. So you can implement different data structures with this in a very convenient way that it almost starts to behave like maybe another programming language, kind of like a way of allocating memory, right? If you're like writing a hash map, you might allocate some cells for your values or like an array for your values. You can kind of use similar sort of techniques for writing dynamic fields. And this is really why I think there's such an improvement over child objects, is we can come in and say, okay, if you want a linked hash map, you can write that. If you want a linked list, you can write that. If you want a priority queue, you can write that. And it will behave in a storage efficient way, which is something that we often is kind of the thing we're going to care most about on the blockchain setting of, you want to make sure that you're only accessing the data from storage that you want or need to.
Thank you very much. Such in-depth detail. I'm trying to find the words for how I feel. Ah, yes. Amazing. Now, it looks like we have some community questions as well. Ashok, will you answer this one? What are typical issues when migrating to dynamic fields? Do you have any tips for us?
Yeah, sure. And actually, before I start on that question, which is a good one, I have to say every time Todd talks about the opportunities for dynamic fields, linked hash maps comes up. So I think it's no secret that he wants someone to build linked hash maps.
I have this soft spot in my heart for linked hash maps, mostly because of my time working with Hack and PHP. And it's just, they're a very neat little data structure. And it's like pretty much everything in PHP is a linked hash map. So maybe I just have kind of a historical bias there, I'm like, oh, I need a data structure. Well, I just need a PHP array, and that's a linked hash map.
Bless you for coming away from PHP with a positive experience.
Oh, yeah.
All right, migrating to dynamic fields. So this will be kind of, if you are familiar with child objects, that's what you were using before. Maybe you built some smart contracts using that before, and now dynamic field is the new API that you need to use. What are some of the things you need to look out for? I'd say the first thing to look out for is you need to choose a field name now. So child objects, you didn't have a field. It was just an association between objects, and it was anonymous, right? You were just linking up that this object in a way owned or was the parent of the other. And now you get to name those associations. And not only do you get to, but you have to. So I would say the migration guide that we published recently gives you a way to do that works for everything, which is to use the ID of the child object, what was previously the child object, as the name of the field, and the child object as the value. That will always work, but there's probably a more convenient, more sensible setup that is kind of specific to the smart contract that you're writing. So I'd encourage you to look out for that, because you're probably trying to name those associations in some other way, somewhere else in your data structures. So that's something to look out for. The other thing is we have a distinction now between what we call dynamic fields and dynamic object fields. There was a lot of discussion over the naming here. I think these are quite nuanced concepts, so apologies in advance. But the distinction here is that before, with child objects, they had to be objects, i.e. they had to have an ID and they had to be kind of previously in storage, and we kind of storing them in storage as well when they become child objects. They just are no longer accessible outside of their relationship with the parent. With dynamic fields, that's no longer true. So it's possible to store non-object values in a dynamic field, which is great, but it means that there's a trade-off. If you want to store values that are not objects, then you have to use dynamic field, and dynamic fields will also, in effect, hide or wrap objects that get put in them. Then dynamic object fields are the opposite. You can only store objects in them, but if you do, then other tools can still see that object when you view storage. You won't be able to access that object within Move by its ID, but if you look it up by its ID from externally, then you'll still be able to. So if that's important to you, that's a distinction worth considering as well, because it didn't exist with child objects. And the final thing is the APIs are completely different and not compatible. So as well as doing a wipe on the update that introduced them, we also don't have the old child object APIs anymore. So you will need to revamp your contracts, your packages to work with dynamic fields.
That was actually going to be my next question. So you beat me to it. Todd, is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I was going to hop in and say, I'm sorry that y'all let me name things with dynamic fields and dynamic object fields. Honestly, if anyone here has a suggestion for a better name, we'll probably take it. It's really difficult, though, as Ashok was saying, though. The concepts are so similar, right? There's just this last mile sort of difference in that whether or not the value is its own object in storage or it's sort of bundled up with the key that you're using for the dynamic field name. And yeah, trying to get that nuance across without having like a really obtuse name, I think is difficult. We are kind of using the abbreviation of like field and O field, which isn't any better, but at least you don't have to write out dynamic object field every time you want to use something. But if anyone has any suggestions, yeah, feel free. You can make an issue, a PR, and I'll look at it. You can ping me on Discord or Telegram. So yeah.
See, this just goes to show it is really true. Naming things is one of the hardest problems in computer science. This actually leads me to another question from the community, perhaps for you, Todd. Does this migration to dynamic fields help improve network performance or expand the ecosystem?
Yeah, it's a good question. Network performance is kind of a tricky one because we're not really sure. We didn't have the greatest benchmarks beforehand, and we probably don't afterwards here, like of a difference. And it wasn't sort of the primary concern. Conceptually, sure, there might be like some lightweight network performance and that you're possibly not passing in as many objects ahead of time, right? Instead of passing in that whole chain, if you remember me discussing that previously, of your parent and your grandparent, your great grandparent, you just have to pass in the root node and then everything else could happen dynamically. But if you were migrating things, as Ashok was suggesting, just the sort of naive migration, which is totally fine if you're like, but again, I would encourage you to rethink kind of your underlying API. But if you're using this sort of naive migration, you'll end up with roughly the same transaction size because you're going to be specifying the dynamic fields in the transaction payload as an argument to the function. So it might help with network performance, but it's probably not really related. I also really want to add to the expand the ecosystem thing, but I don't want to go on too long for the network performance because we really don't know. But I'll just say, I'll drop a little tidbit of like, there is a kind of interesting conceptual difference here of we have a long-term vision for Sui and that your objects don't, or a node or a validator, right, doesn't have to have all of your objects or all of storage really located on one machine. They could have a more traditional database setup and they could, okay, I see that this transaction is using this object. I can go make a request to the database and go fetch that object on a different machine. That's sort of this horizontal scaling aspect for nodes, so they don't have to worry about the storage kind of getting overloaded on a single box. Dynamic fields kind of makes this problem a little bit worse, and that you don't know ahead of time all of the objects you're going to read from storage. You could co-locate them in some clever ways if you want to make it performant, but I'm getting kind of into the weeds here. I just wanted to kind of drop that in. It changes some assumptions here for us. But we're a long ways off from, needing those assumptions or working with that. It's just kind of for the future for network and sort of performance of the protocol. For the ecosystem, I think this is really where we hope things will take off more. It really opens up the door for all sorts of crazy things that you want to do. We've talked about data structures. You could also think about it, we've had this capybara prototype that we've been seeing. It uses dynamic fields for adding these little hats or other little attributes or items that it has equipped. It can be really good for that sort of thing. It's really great for anything that, you might want a really large set of data. So before, just as an example, I think a common thing that we see with a lot of data on the network is like a name service. So you have some address, right? And you want to associate it with a name. This was actually kind of hard to implement ahead of time, just in that we didn't have a great way of having large data stored on chain. And now it's almost like a 1 or 2 line function in Move, where you can just say, okay, I have some shared object for my name service. And to resolve the name, you just fetch the dynamic field. So I think that's a very interesting direction that we will have for the ecosystem. And I think that it'd be great, to see what people kind of dream up, what data structures they build, what scalable apps they build. It's kind of the next frontier here for Sui Move.
Yes, it's very exciting to think of all the things people will build. This is new territory. Now, this brings me to another question, perhaps for you, Ashok. We have great plans, of course, for dynamic fields, but are there any current limitations we should be aware of?
Yeah, this is a great question. We were keen to get the feature out to all of you to try and see what you could build with it. And that meant that we did punt on some things that we will definitely be working on and currently are working on. Some examples of that are when it comes to storage rebates, which are a feature of Sui's tokenomics, this idea that you're paying for the storage and you can get that storage rebate back if you delete the object on chain. That it does work in a sense with dynamic fields, but does not work entirely. They're not 100% efficient in that dynamic fields will leave a little bit behind if you remove a field. That's only for now. We're working on the things that will make it possible to completely reclaim that storage. There are some APIs that we still need to build and that they don't exist for related reasons. So currently it's not possible to check whether a field exists with a certain value, but any type for the field value. And those things should hopefully be coming soon. Then on the API side, we didn't ship the RPC endpoint. So in terms of the SDKs and the Explorer support to visualize dynamic fields without seeing all the implementation details, that doesn't exist quite yet. But again, that's something that we are currently working on. And then there's some durability issues. So where if a validator is processing a transaction, it involves dynamic fields, there are some aspects of that where if the validator goes down and back up, then they can end up leaving the objects in a stuck state until we wipe. Now, obviously, these are not things that we want to leave in this state for a very long time. So, we are working on those things next. There's also a broader question about a certain restriction that we have in the APIs. And this is getting quite deep into the details where I know some of the listeners have already had a chance to try dynamic fields and they had this question. So the values in dynamic object fields have what is called a store constraint, which is usually the constraint that we use to say that you can put this object as a field of another within another struct, which on one hand, it does make sense for dynamic object fields to have that restriction because you are adding them as a field. But if you have looked into how they're implemented, you might notice that it doesn't actually need that restriction to work technically. That restriction exists because of something called custom transfer rules. And I think I might get Todd to go into a little bit more of that because I know he's been looking into the implications of this store constraint and what we can do there.
Yeah, I think this kind of goes well into what's coming up in the future, because as Ashok said, we did punt on a lot of things to try to get it out there. So on the store constraint thing, I guess shout out to Paul from OpenRails. He's been talking to me a lot about this sort of thing, and also some other APIs that we might want to be adding for dynamic fields. So on the store constraint thing, the Sui object system is built on top of core move. Like there's a language there, right, of move, and objects were not a part of move to begin with. And there's a little bit of a bumpy road trying to get objects on top of it and get everything we want. And one of the hacks we sort of use is that, okay, if you want to have a custom transfer rule and not expose transferring your objects to the whole world, you don't give your objects store. And the thought process here is that store is this ability that says that your value can exist inside of another value in global storage. In Sui, it'd be that, my value can exist inside of another object or be wrapped in an object. That's what the store ability gives you. And the idea is that, okay, well, if you have the store ability, you basically have public transfers by virtue that you can be wrapped in another object and then be transferred through that outer wrapping object. So with store, you really lose your ability to pin down transfers. So we've kind of tied private transfers to store for that reason. Now, when it comes to dynamic fields, we're sort of thinking, okay, these things behave like fields. Fields wrap whatever value they have. So you should need to have store, and that if you want to have anything around private transfers, you're going to need to kind of make some sort of secondary object was the thinking here. This might not be great for every application. We're trying to think about ways to add back in private transfers with dynamic fields, and it might even mean extending the core language underneath. We're still kind of working that out. If you do have specific use cases that you think about, if you're listening and you're like, oh yeah, I use private transfers and now I have to migrate my stuff, there's a GitHub issue, and you can kind of come chat there or write up some examples or think about why I'm crazy and that the store thing isn't going to work out for you. I do think that the store thing might work out in a lot of cases, but there definitely are some cases where it becomes really annoying to kind of have to work around this, because you have to sort of jump through some hoops to make it a separate object and you're going to wrap in and out of it. It's very annoying. Anything else, the discussion, we can kind of have it on the GitHub issue there. So I guess for other things of what's next, or just kind of additional things that are sort of missing, there's some other APIs I think we could be adding to the dynamic field endpoints to make it a little bit easier to work with. Some of these are going to require extending the move VM in just in very small ways of basically letting you interact with the underlying field, even if you don't know the type of the value. So there's some cases, as Ashok was hinting at, of just checking it We need some different functionality on our Sui side around objects. But for actually modifying it, you can imagine you might want to drop the field, even though you don't know the value, just get rid of it. Or you might want to take the field and give it a different field name without actually having to load up the value and know its type. So kind of pushing it out of the way. All of these things we're going to need a little bit more time to figure out. And we'll also be making some improvements on the performance side of things, just small details here. And also improving the network stability. I'm just trying to think of ways to summarize this succinctly without getting into all the details of what exactly these changes mean.
That's right. I think you did a great job. Thank you. Ashok, is there anything you'd like to add?
I think Todd covered everything there.
Awesome. So I'd like to shift gears just a little bit, and we'll start taking questions from the audience here in Twitter Spaces. So if you have a question, please make a request, and we'll try to get to as many of you as we can. In the meantime, I found here a question from our form that people filled out ahead of time. This question I thought was interesting, and I'd like to have the both of you make an attempt. The question is, explain it like I'm 5 for the rest of us, please.
Yeah, I mean, if I wanted to distill it down, I would say it's a way to add and remove properties on objects dynamically. So whenever you like.
Maybe explain dynamic versus static here.
Yeah, so dynamic here means a couple of things. So it means that you can add these properties or fields after you've defined the type of the object, after you have even created an instance of that object. That's one level of dynamism. The other is you don't have to know which fields or which properties you want to access ahead of time, which doesn't sound very exciting if you're used to fields in other programming languages. But if you're used to child objects, it is extremely exciting, right? Because there you had to know exactly which chain of properties you wanted to access ahead of time, and you put them all in your entry function, one after the other. So if you're a 5-year-old who has used child objects, now your life is much easier. You only need to pass in the top object, in that the object that is owned by an address or is shared, and then you can just decide whenever you like, whilst the transaction is running, which fields you want to access off of it.
Amazing. So what I'm hearing is, for me as a 5-year-old, this makes it much easier for me to create a flexible NFT collection.
Sure. You're not wrong. It's just like you can do so much more. So I hate just like pinning it on like, oh yeah, your NFT collection's cooler or something. It's like there's so much more you can do. I think the other way I was describe it of maybe not a 5-year-old, but if you're used to other programming languages, so you're in like a 201 course or something, it's kind of going from, they're now like this amalgamation of, before we were only these C++ or Rust style struct declarations where you have a record and that's a set of field identifiers and they're just all there statically ahead of time, into a JavaScript object or a Python dictionary where you can just throw in different keys dynamically and then retrieve the values there. So I think that, for the JavaScript or Python folks, this might sound kind of boring. It's like, okay, yeah, of course I can do that. Why wasn't I able to do that before? But for maybe the C++ or Rust folks, they might appreciate the feature there.
Thank you both. That was great. I think this was helpful both for myself and I'm sure for many in the audience. Now, before we take questions from the audience, a couple housekeeping items. One, this Twitter Spaces is being recorded and will be available for listening later. Also, there are no official plans for an airdrop at this time. So if that's your question, please. Additionally, although we will have time to feature projects in the community, this is not the time to shill. So with that said, I will begin bringing folks up on stage. Perhaps Benny JS has something to say.
Hello, can you hear me?
We can. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good, and it's my first time talking to an AI, at least realizing I talked to an AI. So I scratched that off the bucket list. But I had a question about getting some test tokens to try out the testnet. Is that Faucet issue fixed, or is there another Faucet somewhere?
There have been issues, I know, with the Faucet, mostly from stability issues we've been facing with newer releases of DevNet. I would just keep an eye out on the Discord. There's the dev-faucetnet channel. I believe I have the name right. Or devnet-faucet, yeah. It looks like it's working as of this morning. I see people right now it goes burr, and then it adds 5 Sui test objects to your wallet. So you should be able to check that out. It should be working now.
That's right. Additionally, as of version 0.2.1 of the official Sui wallet, There is a Faucet button directly in the app. So check that out on your browser extension. Do you have anything else you'd like to ask?
Just a personal appeal. Anybody gonna drop one of those nice, pretty ecosystem charts anytime soon?
Great question. I believe that is in the works. Stay tuned on our Discord. Okay. CW, do you have something you'd like to say?
Yes, hello everybody. Thanks for having me up. Can you hear me okay?
I can.
Yeah, thanks for hosting the space. I came in kind of late, so I apologize if this was covered at the top. And if it was, you can just direct me to listen to the recording. Just more of like a high-level question, as I'm getting more informed on Sui and its applications. Just at a very broad, high level, what do you see Sui being able to do compared to other blockchain protocols and platforms out there that will help drive more innovation in adoption of blockchain processes, products, use cases? And what are sort of some of the very early applications that you're most excited to see coming down the pipe? Thank you.
That's a really good question. So in terms of some of the novel work that's gone into Sui, I'll cover a couple that come top of mind, and maybe Todd, you'll have some more. The first one, just because we're biased from the Move team, is obviously Move as a smart contract language. It is obviously used in other blockchains as well, but it offers a lot of safety improvements and expressivity improvements over the kind of incumbent blockchain languages like Solidity and et cetera. So that is one thing that I'm really looking forward to seeing builders take and run with. And obviously that's something that we're excited to build with you. The other aspect of Sui that's interesting is this notion of we have this differentiation between objects that you alone own and objects that are shared. And that gives us an ability to finalize transactions that are only deal with objects that you own much, much faster, right? They don't have to go through consensus. So it'll be really interesting to see the kinds of dApps that people can build when they have that flexibility to say, hey, we can express this in terms of objects that our users own, and that's the fast path. And here's the stuff that deals with shared objects, which have to go through consensus and things like that. And even there with consensus, that's done in a way where we intelligently figure out which shared objects you're going to touch and allow parallelism between transactions that touch completely distinct shared objects. So lots of exciting stuff going on there.
Yeah, I'll underscore that Move is I think a better language for the sort of properties you care about when programming smart contracts. I think that previous languages, like EVM style languages or Solidity, tended to over focus. And I don't mean this in a bad way. Honestly, if we had started from their position, we might have made the same mistakes. If they sort of started from a position of generality or programmer expressiveness of okay, yeah, it's a programming language. You got interfaces, you got dynamic dispatch and method calls and all sorts of things that you're used to. And then you start seeing a lot of bugs and, reentrancy problems and poison tokens and all sorts of other kind of nasty patterns and attack vectors. It's okay, maybe we don't want the whole kitchen sink of programmability and expressiveness. And actually we want to, programming languages are interesting in what they don't allow you to do. And by that, it creates a space for you to do certain things safely, is how I'd kind of think about it. And I think that's true for even very, very expressive or general languages like Python, where you can just do whatever, all sorts of quirky dynamic things. There are still things it doesn't let you do. So I think that's kind of that's obviously one thing for what makes Sui interesting. I'd also kind of encourage people to think about the faster path here. We sometimes call them single writer objects or owned objects, or the non-shared object variant. If you're coming from the Ethereum world, it's going to be very easy, especially with dynamic fields and tables. It's actually going to be very easy for you to conceptually port your code, right? If you have a Solidity contract, you can just make a single shared object for it, and you'll have a big table where you can use, we now have U256, so you can make a table whose entries are U256, and you can throw whatever values in there you want, and you're going to feel right at home. But it's not going to be as efficient as you can be on the network. It'll still be faster, and that shared object will be parallel when compared to something like Ethereum, where all transactions are ordered with each other, even though they don't relate to each other and have no dependencies. It'll still be faster in that regard, but I kind of encourage people to really, if they're building something and they really care about efficiency or keeping costs low and these sort of things, just to think about how could I do this differently, and with the tools that I have in Sui, with single writer or owned objects. It's a whole new world there. Obviously I'm biased for when I think about what makes Sui interesting to me, it's on the Move side, but there are lots of other interesting things for Sui on different layers.
I agree. What I hear is developer experience, security, performance, predictability. all these things. Ashok, you were saying.
So I wanted to call out a tweet that Costas, one of our co-founders and the chief cryptographer, put out a while back now. But he has a document with like 10, probably about on the order of 30 dApps that you could build using the single owner paradigm. So that would be super interesting to see some people riff on that and try some of those ideas out.
Yes, maybe someone could pin that tweet to the space. Now, I see we have another guest, Deptos. Do you have something you'd like to say?
Hey Akasha, how are you?
I'm doing very well. How are you?
I'm very good. Hi everyone. So I have a few questions I want to ask. So my first question is the grant only for developers or anyone who is working on any project can apply for it?
Yes, everyone in the community is welcome to engage with the Sui Foundation and the grant program. We're also building a number of platforms for members of our community to connect with other builders. So keep an eye out for that on our Discord.
Okay, and my second question is the grant only for open source projects? If yes, can you please explain what do you mean by open source?
I'll just say, yeah, probably there's a Discord channel or thread that'd probably be best to ask there. If you hop into Discord and you go anywhere and you start asking this, I'm sure you'll end up in the right place. I'm not sure the best channel. But I believe there is a special channel.
That's right. There is.
Okay, cool. So I have one more question I want to ask. Can we get an estimated date for mainnet launch?
Yes, we'll get back to you on that. It sounds like your dog has a question as well.
He's asking about the mainnet launch.
I mean, I know this is something that lots of people are interested in. I think for us, the priority is we want to make sure it's rock solid before we go. So that's why we don't want to give you, make a promise here and then kind of go back on it. So it's the kind of, it's ready when it's ready. But, when we have some more details there, I'm sure Akasha or other folks on our comms team will be more than eager to let you know.
I'm asking this question because previously Aptos just did a stealth launch of their mainnet. So I'm just worried that this might happen again.
Well, I can say we communicate broadly through social media. So make sure you're in our Discord, follow our Twitter account, and join our Telegram group.
Okay, thank you so much.
Of course. Thank you for your questions and for your interest. So we're almost at time. I'd like to give our guests any last opportunity for questions or comments. BBC, welcome. Do you have a question?
Good day.
Hello. Welcome to the stage. How are you?
I'm fine. I was asking, I actually saw some NFTs launching on Sui, so I don't know if it's actually we can mint them because I was confused. Maybe they are scams or something like that.
That's a great question. Right now, since we're only in DevNet, any NFTs you mint will be wiped regularly. So, as of right now, I'm not sure. I would exercise caution. Ashok, do you have any last comments?
Thank you to everyone for joining and for all the great questions. Thank you to you as well, Akasha, for hosting, and to Todd.
Yes, happy to be here. Todd.
Yeah, just thanks everyone. And just plug in again if you have any specific questions on various, even if it's not move related, we got all sorts of channels on Discord. And there's always the very active Telegram group, which I always find overwhelming, but it's still there and it's still very active.
Yes, it's very appropriately named Suinami. Now, I see Aubert has joined us one last time, and I'd like to give them the opportunity to speak if they're able.
Am I audible?
Hello. Yes, you did it.
Thank you so much. I have a question. I just want to know what are the future goals of this Sui ecosystem and how is it different from other blockchain projects like currently we have Aptos. There are a lot of similarities between Sui and the Aptos ecosystem. What makes Sui different?
I'd say when focusing on Sui, so we have kind of like a two different sort of spots, right, for where I think about us being differentiated. They're sort of at the high level for the parallelism of the network, right? In Sui, you specify what objects ahead of time you're going to access. And similarly for whether they be for single writer owned objects or for shared objects. And this allows for more parallelism among, just kind of ahead of time of a little easier conceptually to think, okay, I know I'm accessing exactly this object. As long as no one else is accessing the shared object, it'll go through very quickly. Otherwise, I'll have to sit through Imagine if you have a very active shared object, for some sort of game or marketplace or something, you might be there a little bit longer, but you could always make a new shared object. Or I would always imagine you kind of have a better level of granularity from a developer standpoint for partitioning your objects in that way, which should hopefully lead to better kind of scalability. Horizontal scalability is kind of a thing we always talk about here as compared to sort of other protocols. And then on the Move side, we've made Sui Move does not use Move's core storage. And we think that, I will say that dynamic fields brings it a little bit closer to things like table on the core Move side of things. But at the same time, I was never pleased with where we ended up with global storage. It was a lot of iterations and really layers on top of things to get things working for this kind of big single account model that we had in core Move. And to be honest, the object model we ended up with is kind of similar to some ideas we had very early on that we never pursued. So I'm excited to see how people can program in that space. I just think it's a more flexible and hopefully natural model when compared to the kind of global storage access model. I don't know if I have like an analogy for programming in it, but at least to me, it kind of maybe roughly feels like that. No, I'm not going to describe it because it's not going to make any sense to anyone but me. So maybe if Ashok or someone else has the ability to, kind of highlight some differences between, I know Ashok, you haven't been on Move for a super long time, but if you have anything else you want to plug.
Yeah, I'll take a kind of different angle at it, which is the underlying motivation for Sui. Like, why are we working on Sui as a new blockchain and a new technology versus using something else that exists or contributing to something else that exists? I think the main reason there is Sui is designed to connect the next billion users to blockchain. And what that translates to is some of this stuff around scalability, parallelism, being able to have, our validators distributed across multiple workers and things like that is really designed from the get-go to support that kind of use case, which is very different from the technology that was created, for example, for DM back in the day in Meta. That was a very different use case for kind of interbank communication, where the requirements around how many different parties are working on the chain, what the trust model is between them is all very different. So that's why the folks who co-founded Mr. Labs and started working on Sui took this kind of second run at it. It is to support a different purpose and one that hopefully, the folks building with us are excited by.
That's right. And I'd also like to just add the strength of our community is something that also differentiates us. This is something that I believe, of course, but also feedback we get regularly at community events. Something also worth considering.
I'll definitely plus one that there was a couple of folks who, when we launched Dynamic Fields, they were asking questions in Discord, but solving their problems faster than we could and more novel ways than we could. So we were definitely learning from all of you as well.
Yes. Well, I think that just about wraps us up. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And thank you, especially to Ashok and Todd, for being here to answer all of our questions.